Um, we're going to get started with our luncheon speaker. I want to remind everybody that following this panel, we're going to have an additional panel on Chinese public diplomacy in Central Asia, and then we're going to talk about the policy implications. And finally, for those of you who I hope stay in the late afternoon, at 5 o'clock, we're going to have a reception. So it's a privilege to have with us today Ambassador Shyam Saran, who is currently Senior Fellow at the Center for Policy Research. He is, of course, a former Foreign Secretary. He has also served as the Prime Minister's Special Envoy for Nuclear Affairs and Climate Change, Chairman of the National Security Advisory Board, and Chairman of the Research and Information System for Developing Countries. He is also a former ambassador to many countries, Myanmar, Indonesia, Nepal, and High Commissioner to Mauritius. I was reading a very short article that Ambassador Saran wrote just last month. It was a piece published by the Hindustan Times on the foreign policy opportunities that India must seize in 2020. And I thought it was notable that there were a few references to Chinese influence in India's neighborhood. And Ambassador Saran wrote that the rise in Chinese political and economic influence will be a continuing concern for India. And he also noted that the change in government in the Maldives had brought some sense of relief as China's dominating presence was rolled back. And then in Sri Lanka, he expressed some worry about the potential for a resurgence of Chinese influence. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing more of your perspectives, Ambassador Saran, on the issue of Chinese political and economic influence. And we've talked a lot about public diplomacy, but I think as correctly stated in the prior panel, that domestically, when the Chinese in their own language talk about it, they're really talking about propaganda. It is domestic propaganda, it is external propaganda. When they talk about the provision of public goods, that's the adoption of Western and English language that's just translated into Chinese, but that's not really the way that they think about it. So, I thought I'd start with a broad question about how you see Chinese ambitions in this region, in South Asia and Central Asia, maybe even in the broader Indo-Pacific region, and how does the issue of the public diplomacy fit into their regional ambitions? Is this an important tool for China to achieve its ambitions in this region and beyond? And I think you have a microphone there.
Thank you very much, Bonnie, and let me say what a pleasure it is to have this opportunity to meet you and to interact with you. I would also like to thank, of course, the sponsors of this conference, ORF, Asia Society Policy Institute, also Aid Data, as well as CSIS. So the topic given to me is Chinese economic and political influence in India and China's broader regional strategy. Let me begin by addressing, the issue of public diplomacy. I think I would like to, in that context, say that it has been mentioned that in its influence operations, China is doing not anything very different from what all great powers do. So that's not a surprise. That is something that we have been watching for a long time. I think more interesting is to really see what is different about China and the posture it takes. Because in one sense, it is true that power is its own advertisement. That's if you are looking at public diplomacy, the fact that you are a very successful power, that speaks much more than perhaps anything else. So I think we should recognize that. I think what is perhaps worth looking at is how does China go about projecting its power? And I think here I would say that in my view, China is perhaps somewhat better in constructing narratives around its power than perhaps many other countries are. For example, the use of the templates of the past to construct a modern narrative of power. And also, if you're looking at it, if power is exercised through a certain veneer of legitimacy, with certain kind of a version of history, it becomes that much more effective, because this enables a more economical use of power rather than the straightforward use of coercion or even violence in exercising power. So there is a certain value to public diplomacy in terms of creating the kind of narrative that allows this legitimacy and allows, as I said, more economical use of power. So in that sense, if one sees how China has been able to project that, through most of its history, China has been the dominant central power in Asia. And it's only an aberration of history that over about 150 years or so, this was a century of humiliation and, aggression by imperialist powers. But what is happening today, China would argue, that China is doing nothing more than really reoccupying the power or the space that it always has. So there is nothing abnormal about it, and people should accept it, acknowledge it, and not try to resist it. That's one. If you look at the Silk Road, I mean, we are talking about Silk Road diplomacy here. Again, the Belt and Road Initiative is projected as China doing nothing more than, in fact, reimagining what was a reality over hundreds of years. Trade routes emerging out of China. China was the central hub from which trade routes radiated all around the world, whether across the seas or the caravan routes. And Silk Road that we are talking about, One Belt, One Road that we are talking about today, is nothing more but China, in fact, recreating that web of trade and transportation which it did in the past. And therefore, everything is quite natural. It's the natural order that is coming back again. And of course, I would also say, to conclude here, that much of Western discourse about China, until recently, only reinforced this. That yes, China was always the dominant power, when the reality is very different. China was a much more insular power through most of its history. It does not, for example, acknowledge that during large parts of its history, it was actually invaded and occupied by foreigners, whether it is some of the Central Asian tribes, or sometimes you had the Yuan dynasty, you had the Manchu dynasty. Much of the empire that China claims today actually was not the Han Empire, but it was actually the Manchu Empire. And let's not forget that during the early part of the 20th century, the narrative in China was how to get rid of these foreigners who had come and occupied China. That was the nationalist discourse. which has changed completely now. You don't hear about that anymore. So I think we have to recognize that much of the narrative that has been built up and which has been in a sense acquiesced into by most commentators is actually a manufactured version of history. But that history has proved to be very, very useful to China. So when we are looking at the public diplomacy aspect, I think perhaps remembering some of these aspects is perhaps also very important.
You know, in some ways, I think that you could find some overlap between Chinese public diplomacy and that of the United States and other countries. But I think maybe what I'd like to drill down on a little bit is the differences, because I think that there really are substantial differences. And one of the earlier speakers was talking about U.S. efforts to promote democracy, for example. I mean, I see the Chinese as seeking to promote a positive narrative about China, but also dependence on China and deference to China. So it's very much about recognizing that Chinese interests must be respected. So I'd be curious in how you see the differences between, if you were to compare U.S. public diplomacy or even India's public diplomacy to that of China's.
Well, I don't think there is much difference in terms of what I said as a principle, that every great power, tries to construct a sort of veneer of legitimacy, a veneer of even ethical principle in the manner in which it projects its use of power. So in that respect, I don't see much difference, say, between the United States and China. Of course, you can say that the American narrative is perhaps a better narrative because it is, after all, a democracy, while China is not. But let me say what is something of interest today is that China, which was most of the time, even until recently, somewhat defensive about its own political and social system. And it would argue that every country has the right to pursue its own model of political, social, and economic development. That there is no universal kind of a model or superior kind of model that must be adopted by all countries. After the global financial and economic crisis, and in a sense that crisis also was a setback to the principle of democratic politics and liberal economics, China's narrative started changing. So at the 19th Party Congress, you have Xi Jinping, who is talking about how China's success and what China has been able to achieve is actually a good model for a large number of developing countries who are also looking for development. So there is no longer any defensiveness about China's model. In fact, this is something to be emulated by others. This was not the case before. And I think it has also been able to tap into what is a very pervasive sense of pessimism in democracies today. Precisely because of, number one, the crisis, but the fact that, it seems that we have not been able to find the right kind of answers to the economic stagnation or setbacks that we have seen, or the inequalities that we talk about in various societies. So in that respect, if you see the resurgence of narrow nationalism or parochialism, in fact, I say that today in many places you will find what I call dictator envy. That, perhaps this is the age of strong men, people who can cut through all the, kind of infirmities of democracy and be able to achieve the kind of spectacular development that China has been able to. This is something which is perhaps really worth reflecting upon, because I see that not only in some of the European countries, but you see in a lot of other countries, including in India. That sense that China has achieved the success precisely because it has this right mix of authoritarianism and very efficient economic processes.
If we look at public opinion polls such as have been done recently by Pew, there are some countries around the world, developing countries, where China's image is positive. There's a few in Europe. Italy is an example, and I think Greece is fairly positive. Some countries in Africa. There have been many countries where China's image is actually declining. The rate of people that see positively about China, and these are rather recent polls. And so I wonder whether you think that is this a failure of public diplomacy? Is this something that more effective public diplomacy can solve? Or is this simply a matter of Chinese policies that are causing worry, particularly in China's neighborhood?
Let me say that I think for China, the pursuit of its national interest, the defense of its national interest as it perceives it, always takes precedence over image. It is good, of course, if that exercise of power can be, sort of dressed up as something which is positive, as something which is offering a public good. But if there is any kind of contradiction, I think there is no doubt that the primacy will be that of the pursuit. And if that requires use of violence, if it requires teaching people lessons, I don't think China would hesitate from that. It has been its own experience, particularly say after the Tiananmen incident, that even if there is a kind of a public opinion backlash internationally, the fact that China is successful in its economic development, in terms of accumulating power, as I said, that always enables it to get back into the game. So I don't think that the manner in which we perhaps look at public diplomacy as being something very critical to pursuit of interest, for China I would say it is somewhat less.
There's one particular country that has had a deep, I think, experience with, and I will, in this case, really call it Chinese political influence operations, and that is Australia. And there's been a lot of concern in Australia about what has been termed by one person, former journalist John Garneau, who's done a very important study for one of the previous prime ministers. And he distinguished between what you might call the sort of typical normal public diplomacy or political influence operations and what is sometimes referred to as covert, corrupt, and coercive actions. And Australia has seen all of this, and even in the form of financial support for some of their politicians to get individuals to say positive things about Chinese policy. And I wonder if, in your experience looking at this part of the world, and as we're talking about South Asia and Central Asia, whether we see this kind of activity, or is it really primarily, is Australia, is it in some ways unique? I mean, I'm not convinced that it is. I think there are other countries that are waking up to this problem, although countries that have a significant percentage of Chinese diaspora, I think, are more vulnerable to that. But I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that issue.
Well, at the risk of being called cynical, I would say that much of what China may be doing in Australia or in other countries has a lot of precedence. So I do not think that this is something entirely new that you are witnessing. Yes, China is a latecomer in terms of great power politics, and therefore perhaps it arouses more concern than perhaps in the past. Countries do engage in influence operations, and if we have the resources and they have the instruments, they will use them. So I'm not very sure that there is something unique about this. But I would say this, that yes, there is in fact concern about this. You mentioned our own region, South Asia. I certainly see that China is much more active than before in terms of intervening in domestic politics than compared to before. So if you see, for example, Nepal and its cultivation of individual politicians, its financing of various political parties. I'm sure that happens in other South Asian countries as well. So reaching out to a political elite, making it worth their while to support China's objectives, this is something which is new in terms of only the chronological aspect. But it's not something that we have not seen in these countries in the past. So I don't think there is much of a difference.
I wanted to ask a question about India's attitudes towards Chinese Confucius Institutes, which I understand really don't exist in India. I think there was one that was created in Mumbai but is not really operational. And I read that Foreign Minister Wang Yi has been trying to encourage the government here to establish some of these Confucius Institutes. And in the report, this is one of the metrics that is used to assess the tools that China is using. And in the United States, I believe that 29 so far have been shut down, but we still have almost 100 that remain, and very mixed reviews. At some universities, they're actually working very well. We had the ambassador from Bangladesh talk about how there's over 2,000 students at their 3 Confucius Institutes. Is this a policy that India might change going forward? And if not, what are the reservations?
Well, I have always argued that in essence, India-China relations are adversarial in character. There is not much trust about China in India, and therefore there will always be a certain wariness about allowing China to sort of penetrate Indian society or use these kind of institutions for what may be regarded as influence operations, as you mentioned. So I think that wariness will continue. Whether or not in the future a Confucius Institute could come up in India, perhaps that's will depend upon the next informal summit. Perhaps it might emerge out of that as a trust building exercise, but I would not hold my breath in that respect. What I would say is that yes, China in India too has been very active in terms of what we would say public diplomacy. You see a change in the manner in which, say, Chinese diplomats operate in India. Chinese ambassadors, for example, write op-eds in Indian newspapers, giving their view of what India-China relations are. Some of the time you will see, like in other countries, supplements which are put in major newspapers. So those kind of activities are taking place. They take delegations of journalists to China, but I would say that these are actually something which you would expect China to do. I am much more worried about what the expansion of Chinese influence, whether it is in terms of its economic profile, whether it is in terms of its political profile, what does that mean, first of all, in our own periphery, Second, what is happening in what today is being called Indo-Pacific. I think this is where the test will lie, because I think the way China looks at its as its objective here in Asia derives from the narrative that I talked about, that the only place where China could be is at the top of the pile. I mean, this is a hierarchical system that they are looking at. It is both Confucius in nature, because everybody should know his place. And if you have everybody knowing his place, harmony will follow. Therefore, the order that you are looking for is a hierarchical order, because if you have a multipolar order, it will be a chaotic order. So it is, from the Chinese point of view, this is very clear that there is no scope in, for example, Asia Pacific or Indo-Pacific for any kind of a multipolar kind of a system. So it has to be, if the US is not the hegemon, China has to be the hegemon. Only then could you have peace and stability in the region. And if you contest it, then of course this is something which needs China to be able to discipline you in a sense. Now, if you look at how narrative is used, but how that is different from the reality, you need not go any further than what China has now started talking about Indo-Pacific. If you remember, China reacted originally very, very negatively to the concept of Indo-Pacific. In fact, I think Wang Yi, the foreign minister, said it is something like foam on an ocean wave and it will dissipate very quickly. Now China does not say that. Now China has in fact adopted the concept of Indo-Pacific. There are seminars and workshops being held in Beijing on Indo-Pacific and what it represents. And what they have very cleverly done is they have picked up actually the characterization that India has used, that it must be open, it must be transparent, it must be inclusive, it must be balanced. All those adjectives are being used as also representing what China would like to do. Look at what China is doing when it is negotiating the code of conduct with ASEAN countries. If you see all the Chinese demands, they are exactly the opposite of what these adjectives mean. So one of the principles is that extra-regional powers should not be allowed to operate in the region. That as far as projects are concerned, those projects should have, before they are allowed, they should have the consensus of all the countries in the region or who have signed the code of conduct. Now, that is not inclusive, certainly not in the sense that we have talked about it. So I think we have to make those distinctions, what is being said and what you see happening on the ground. And what I see happening on the ground suggests that at least China would like to get to a point where not necessarily occupying territory, but it has a veto over decisions which may be taken by countries in the region, not only with respect to security issues, but also with respect to economic issues. And who determines what the Chinese interest would be? Of course, would be a subjective kind of a projection of Chinese interest.